host, Dimitri Filipovic.
Welcome to the Hockey PDOcast. My name is Dimitri Filipovic, and joining me is my good buddy Pete Blackburn. Pete, what's going on, man?
Not too much. How are you? How's your summer?
It's been going well. I took a week off last week, and I hope the listeners aren't too upset with me. I listen. The past couple of years, I've been taking the full summers off. This year, we decided to do shows all the way through the off season. As I was telling you before we went on the air, peek behind the curtain. My wife is getting super pregnant, and this was our last opportunity to get away for a little bit. So we went to the Sunshine Coast here in BC and had a nice time. And now I'm back at it, and I'm excited to have a fun week of shows. We're gonna kick it off with you. I pitched you on a concept, something we've done on the show in the past, our stakes tiers. But a little bit of a different wrinkle because we're still a ways out from the season. But I think it's a good way for us to kind of like take a big picture view of the league, but also prepare ourselves for sort of where teams are at respectively. And as a reminder of it, Pete and I will be grouping the teams based on, how much they've got on the line this year, or I guess like what their goals are this season. Because obviously only one team can win a Stanley Cup, and I'd say there's probably only seven or eight that are realistically competing for it this year. But I think there's still ways for teams to accomplish whatever their goals are, and so we're gonna rattle through those. We each put together our tiers. We're gonna go in descending order, starting with the bottom of the league. I guess it's not necessarily. I'm not sure if you approach it this way. I don't necessarily view this as like a ranking of the teams necessarily because I had some good teams that are pretty low stakes, I think, and then some teams who probably won't even make the playoffs, but I think it's a very important year for them regardless to show progress. And so it's not necessarily correlated to like a power rankings or anything. It's more so, I guess, how important this year is for them wherever their organization is right now.
Yeah, I think it's more like instead of like power rankings, I feel like it's more like window watching,
Mhm.
like kind of where
Right.
are they in their window? How good is their team? Like what are the expectations heading into this year? If they're not good this year, what does that mean for them beyond this season? And so, yeah, I think it's more of just kind of a look at where teams are at right now heading into the season and kind of what's on the line for them.
Yeah, I viewed it as sort of like organizational urgency in a
Mhm.
way. And we're gonna get through all of them. We have eight tiers each. When we started this exercise, had it like four or five kind of bigger ones, and I think it's gonna be easier for us to follow, but also the listeners if they're smaller groupings of teams and maybe more kind of neatly packed together. Tier eight for me, the bottom tier, the true tankers, in my opinion, who do not care about this season at all. I only have two teams in this list, which I feel like I'm trying to remember previous seasons. I feel like at this point of the offseason, they were more expansive. Like I feel like there were at least like four or five teams where you're like, man, this team's gonna suck and they're happy with it. They're gonna try to get the first overall pick. That's what they need to do. I'm not sure whether it's because of all these changes we've seen with the cap going up, the draft kind of becoming more muddled, teams moving first rounders. Like it feels like for whatever reason, there's fewer teams than ever that I think have an appetite to be bad this season. Now, someone's going to have to finish, 30th and 29th. There's going to be bad teams regardless. That's the nature of the league. But I really think the Canucks and the Flames, who I had in this tier, are the only two teams who have kind of positioned themselves to like be bad on purpose.
Yeah, so I have so my tier here is like I kind of put a little tagline next to each number just to give me a basic outline. And so
Hmm.
I have like no real expectations or consequences
Okay.
for this tier. And so I have the Flames and I also have the Seattle Kraken. And the Kraken to me are an interesting one because like they should feel a sense of organizational urgency, but it's hard for me to feel like anything is truly at stake based off of the outcome of this season. And honestly, if they suck this year, like that's probably better for them, like in terms of the scope of where they're at. So, you know, I just it's hard for me to look at anything that Seattle does right now and have like strong feelings about it and feel like there's really anything big at stake.
The reason why I had the Kraken at the top of the next tier seven on my list was just because I feel like they've kind of telegraphed this summer that they don't want to be bad. Like I think they are kind of showing or demonstrating that they are feeling that organizational urgency, right? It goes back to last trade deadline when they tried to acquire Temi Panarin and extend him than Jason Robertson before the draft. And I feel like they've been trying to take these kind of home run cuts and get better or at least relevant in the league, and have failed to do so. And I guess they've kind of settled into a spot where like their biggest addition, if you want to frame it that way, was just retaining Bobby McMahon, who they acquired at the trade deadline, and giving him a big contract. But I'm with you in terms of like they're probably better suited just completely bottoming out even more so than they have the past couple of years, because it would probably push them in the direction of trading Vince Dunn and Jared McCann, who are going to be UFAs next summer and are going to be kind of in that awkward 30-year-old range where you don't really want to retain them, but they're good players. And the Kraken have showed that they're going to be happy to keep those guys because they can't really get that tier above. So they're probably be better off just being really bad, but I don't think they really want to, right? Like they've tried to do everything they can to become at least middling or mediocre and have failed to do so. But I think that's fair. You're the Canucks in this tier as well, right?
No, I have the Canucks one tier above. So I have them in. So I did like the opposite. So I did 8 to 1, one being like no real, but
Okay.
I'll adjust stuff of how you started. So I have them in my seventh tier, just because I feel like there is some pressure to like get off on the right foot under a new regime.
Mhm.
Like if they're just as bad and just as much of a mess under this new regime, you're like, okay, what the hell is going on here? And then you have bigger problems and bigger questions to ask about sort of the DNA of that franchise and that and kind of where they are organizationally. So that's why I have them in seven. But like I very much could see putting them in your eighth as well.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess the way I viewed it with them is I viewed the new regime as a positive in the sense that it feels like, and their actions have kind of borne this out so far this offseason, that they've finally seen the light in terms of like we need to be bad and we're gonna actually rebuild properly for once. And so they like judiciously spent, right? Like they just bring in like guys who are going to be useful roster players or veterans, but are on short, cheap deals that they could probably flip at some point this season, like a Jamie Oleksiak or a Luke Shen or even a Paul Cotter. They trade away Marcus Pettersson for a first. Like it seems like they're finally taking a long view here, and I imagine that means that Manny Malhotra and Ryan Johnson and everyone involved is going to get a lot of runway and has probably been given at least some sort of green light to really kind of tear this thing down as much as they can and start this process earnestly. And so I feel like they're probably the most willing to tank, whereas the Flames, I think, are going to be bad. But, they go out and they spend a couple late firsts on Shimon Nemitz. Their goaltending, I guess you could say the same about the Canucks if Demko's healthy, but between Devin Cooley and Dustin Wolf, that might be a bit of a roadblock for the Flames being truly the worst team in the league because they're going to give them above league average goaltending every night. But man, the forward group for this Flames team is pretty unavoidably bad. And so I love a guy like Matt Gridden, but it's pretty, there's a lot of work to be done, let's say. But I do think the state of the blue line, like the young kind of high upside offensive defenseman that they're integrating here, is at least going to be fun. So I'd almost view the Canucks as like their own separate entity. But I wanted to put the Flames there with them, and I think the Kraken is a fair shout. Did you have anyone else in
Yeah,
this bottom tier?
I I have the Rangers here, which is like maybe a bit surprising, but like it feels like the stakes are lower because they already know that they're kind of rebuilding and they've already started that process. So like it doesn't feel like they're truly expecting to contend, expecting to be great, even with like the Dorofeev signing and the Bjorkstrand signing. Like it just feels like they're kind of in a transition period, which lowers the stakes when they know that.
Yes. My counter would be they traded away two future firsts. Now they're down the line and they're lottery protected, so it gives them a bit of insulation. But I'm not entirely sold that Chris Drury and that organization actually wants to be bad. And listen, if Shesterkin's going to be healthy, if Fox is going to be healthy this season, like they're going to be competitive. I actually liked the players they added this summer, even if I didn't necessarily agree with trading future first the way they did. But I had them a bit higher. I had them in my like tier six or whatever, a couple rungs up just because of that trading away future first. Like I think that signals to me that they're not going to be actively bad and they might be forced in that position, but I don't think they're entering the season thinking that way. Tier seven for me. So I had the Kraken, as I said. I had three other teams, and I'm curious where you had them. I had the Detroit Red Wings, I had the
Wow.
Nashville Predators, and I had the Winnipeg Jets.
So that's really surprising because I have the Red Wings as my first, like code red stakes, just because of like I know that there's more to this team than Dylan Larkin, but given that the fact that this team is like now the new Buffalo Sabres in being viewed as like the punching bag of the league. They have the league's longest playoff drought. Their captain doesn't want to be there. It's just like they don't have a GM right now. Like it's just there's so much turmoil, and I guess you could hold the GM thing as a reason why there aren't massive stakes or consequences because they can just kind of point to that reset button. But like there are major fallout potential as a result of how the season starts, how the season progresses for Detroit. And like that's why I view them as one of like the code red teams in the league.
I mean, it's fair in the sense that they've missed the playoffs for 10 straight years. And I think their fan base is quite upset about it, deservedly so. And they've had a couple of close calls the past couple of years, which has almost twisted the knife even further. But they don't have a GM, and it's August 11th as we're recording. Their second best defenseman doesn't have a contract. Their captain and number one center is most likely not going to be on the team. And they're probably in the most competitive division as well, right? Where like every other team is at least a viable playoff option. And so I think it's kind of unavoidable where I think they probably do want to be competitive and try to end this playoff drought, but I feel like they're almost being boxed into a spot here, assuming some sort of a dramatic change of heart from Larkin and um, a quick process where they bring in a GM and get the Vincent contract signed. And I'm sure they're going to figure that out before the start of the season. But as we're recording right now, like I'm not really sensing that much urgency from them. I feel like
To me,
moving on from Eiserman in a way kind of gave them a bit of a pass to like reset this a little bit. I'm not sure if their fans view it that way, but that's kind of the way I'm interpreting it.
yeah, like the lack of urgency to me like kind of signals like why the stakes are a little bit higher because you would think that after the run that they've been on, especially kind of the way that they've fallen apart at the final stretch in the past few seasons, just like something seeming to be in the water there. You would think that like something significant would change roster wise, but really the only change roster wise for this team has been Kane out, Arvidsson in. Like that's kind of around a net neutral, and it just does not change the makeup of their team whatsoever. So, like, maybe it's just my view of them organizationally rather than the way that they perceive themselves being the gap in kind of where we are here in terms of the rankings. But like, I just think that this team has to figure it out pretty quickly and go in one direction or another.
Yeah, I think the stakes are high from that perspective. I guess for this season, though, I just don't really see a path forward, regardless of what they did, where it would result in a positive, right? Unless they go dramatically in that direction of like really kind of starting from scratch. But man, like Mo Seider is so good right now, and so is Lucas Raymond, and they have some players there who at least like are good and entering their prime. That in combination with having missed the playoffs for 10 straight years makes that a pretty tough sell, in my opinion.
But think about it like from like the Bruins perspective or like Ottawa's perspective last year. And I know the Eastern Conference was really weird last year and kind of an outlier year in terms of like anybody could really get in. But like Detroit was there at the end of the year and the bottom fell out and they fell out of that picture. What's to say that they can't be in the mix again, not fall apart down the final stretch, and they at least get a playoff berth? And if Larkin is there, maybe that gives him a little bit of okay, we're moving in the right direction. I'll stay.
I mean, the shame of it, and this is not kind of a new insight by any means, but because of his no move clause and the position they're in, it sort of boxed him into a corner where like he had picked what three, four destinations, which are the best teams in the league that everyone wants to go to, and those teams recognize that they don't need to pay a premium and aren't really in a position to give the Red Wings what they need. Because I do think otherwise, like I'd be open to a glass half full interpretation of this situation where it's like Larkin's a good player, but he's not, we've seen sort of the limits of what it's going to be if he's your number one center. And I do think there's a way where they could have pivoted to adding interesting players and then kind of building around other guys in their team right now and maybe taking a slight step back this year, but being better for it in the long term. But I'm not sure what that path is via the realistic trade options right now, right? Like any trade with Minnesota or Vegas or whatever, I don't really see what that's going to accomplish for them. And so maybe he comes back and you just sort of run back last year's team. And that might be the least interesting option of the bunch, just because we've sort of seen what that looks like. And it's probably the 17th best team in the league and not having a good draft pick and kind of just being stuck for yet another year. What do you think about the Predators here? The reason why I had them is the new GM, right? They bring in Chris McFarland from Colorado. They to lure him over, they give him just an empty canvas pretty much in terms of green light, do whatever you want. They were very active. I liked bringing in a Maverick Bork and sort of stealing him from the Stars. They bring in Jack Drury. They pretty much brought in everyone from Colorado that wasn't tied down. They still have a lot of work to do. We'll see what happens with guys like Ryan O'Reilly and Roman Yossi and Steven Stamkos and some of the veterans. But I feel like because of that new GM and sort of all the assets they've accrued along the way here this offseason, it's given them pretty low stakes in terms of like I think people are pretty happy that they finally brought in a fresh voice. It's not Barry Trotz or David Poyle or someone who's been there forever, and they're moving in a different direction. And so I feel like regardless of what where they finish in the standings this year, it signals like a fresh start for them. And that's why it almost puts very little pressure on how they actually do this year, in my opinion.
Yeah, but I think like the counter there for me, and I had them where did I have them? Just like a little bit over in the middle.
Mhm.
And to me, it's like I think that there are some stakes here because of the fact that they're hitting the reset button. And I liked their offseason and I like some of the ads that they made. Like new GM, like it feels like there are potential swings that could happen based off of the way that they start the season, where they're at the midpoint. Like I could see a realistic situation where like if they're not good to start the year, then like maybe they explore a Stamkos trade. Maybe they trade Ryan O'Reilly. Like, but on the other hand, because they've sort of filled in some of the gaps around their forward group, like I think that this could be a team that is somewhat competitive-ish. And like that feels like pretty significant swing potential to start this year. So I put them somewhere in the middle where it's like I don't think they're in any sort of panic mode, but there are paths in front of them and they're pretty drastically different.
Yeah, I think they have optionality, which is really good,
Yeah.
right? Like I think depending on how the season starts or what they choose to do ultimately, like they could do any number of things, and that's a nice spot to be in. I said I had the Jets here as well. I struggled with this one because I do think they feel internal or organizational urgency because they've been very vocal about concerns about the market kind of tuning the team out and it not being financially viable. And that's why they refuse to rebuild. We'll see what happens with Connor Hellebuck's status and if he's on the team at the start of the year, and that's certainly going to change the dynamic. But I, maybe this was just a personal sort of bias in my opinion, but I viewed it as low stakes because I just don't see the upside with this current group. And I feel like if anything, another season like last one, if it pushes them further in a direction and kind of enables a possibility of actually building this thing outright, is superior to me. But they're in a tricky spot because even if Hellebuck's not there, you've got Shifley and Connor making a ton of money and entering a different stage of their career as they get into their 30s. Josh Morrissey and Dylan Sandberg, their two best defensemen, are 2 years out from UFA and getting up there in age as well. And so, like, I'm curious to see what their approach is. But man, when you're in a division with Colorado, Dallas, Minnesota, Utah, you mentioned Nashville there and them being feisty. I think St. Louis certainly qualifies as well. Like, it's pretty tricky for them to kind of move forward in the Central with the team they have right now and how bad they were last season. So I don't know, where do you kind of net out with the Jets and where they tiered for you?
Yeah, so I have them in the fourth tier,
Okay,
which is,
so kind of middle of the pack.
yeah, and I feel like they don't need to be good, but they it feels like maybe they need to be better if they're going to keep this group around. But it honestly feels like a lost cause because Generally, it feels like we've seen the best of this current group in this current core as it is established. Like, I don't know when they decide to push that button. And like you said, the financial viability of a rebuild or a retool is costly from an organizational perspective, and maybe they don't want to do that. But I just like it's hard for me to take this team seriously and feel like there are real stakes because there have been points where it has felt like real stakes and it has felt like a really good team and it just hasn't gone anywhere. So again, like it just feels like we've seen the best version of this team and now we're kind of on the back nine and just waiting for it to play out.
Yeah. I remember when I did this exercise 2 years ago, I had them number one in terms of stakes, kind of entering that postseason when they were winning the President's Trophy. And I think that was borne out correct, right? Like Nick Ehlers is going to be a UFA. They were really good, and it was a bit of a squandered opportunity for them that postseason. And it's been downhill since then. Did you have anyone else in this tier? Or because we've gone through all of my tier eight and tier seven teams.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm good on 8 and 7.
So tier six, this might be my least favorite tier of this because I kind of just lumped together a bunch of teams who don't necessarily even belong together, but I didn't really know what to do with them. I don't really see an upside for this season, but I also don't think it matters that much in the grand scheme of things. And that was the Rangers, who we've already talked about, the LA Kings, your Boston Bruins, when I'm excited to talk about, and then the Penguins and the Flyers.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. It's like I labeled this tier as the retooling tier, which
Mhm.
is just like there's no real expectations because these teams are just kind of in the middle of changing their DNA a little bit. And I have the Maple Leafs, the Blackhawks, and the Senators.
That's interesting. I had the Leafs tier three, significantly higher. And I guess we should talk about it now, real quick. The reason for that is one, they've already moved or they don't have access to their first rounder in the next two drafts. They're coming off a pretty miserable year where they completely cleaned house. Now you could argue that, it's a fresh start for the coach and GM, and so you have a bit more runway. But in that market, I don't really think that's going to do them a lot of good if the team's as bad as it was last year. And then you're entering a spot where Austin Matthews is going to be extension eligible next summer. And so, like, the viability of this organization in terms of how this year goes and what it looks like, it's a bit of a crossroads moment. Like, I think you're going to need to make some tough decisions as soon as next summer. And so, they really remodeled the bottom of their lineup. They made a lot of changes. They bring in Bobrovsky and reshuffle their goaltending. Like, it's an entirely different looking team. Of course, Baldior as well comes in for the top unit power play. But I think it's not a make or break season for them, but I do think it's a pretty important one because, like, if this goes bad, I feel like it could really go in an extreme direction. And I think they need to show that last year was a bit of an aberration and they can at least get back to being competitive and kind of convince Matthews that he should just stay there for the rest of his career.
Yeah, so I totally understand that, and I think that's like a very valid viewpoint. I think that maybe like my assumption bias is just that this team is not going to be anywhere close to as bad as they were last year.
Yep.
And like that will kind of just remove the stakes. But I guess you're right. Like if they do absolutely suck, then yeah, there are massive consequences that could be a result there. But like I do feel like the McKenna acquisition presents a reset button and presents sort of like this new runway. They do have a new regime, and yeah, pressure will be on them, but like they are also currently living with some of the mistakes of the previous regime. So they have plausible deniability there. And it's year one of like a new era sort of type deal. So I don't know. That's kind of why I put them on the higher side where there's enough plausible deniability that if things go wrong, that they can just say, all right, well, this is just year one in this new plan that we have, and there are growing pains for a player like McKenna. But yeah, you're right in the sense that if it's just as bad as last year, there are some questions to be asked for sure, especially without the draft picks.
I also had the Blackhawks higher. I had them in tier four. And the reason for that, and maybe, Bedard's injury in the offseason and missing the start of the year is going to temper expectations a little bit. But um, I do think, man, like Kyle Davidson has gotten a pretty free pass for the most part. in terms of like obviously a difficult situation he inherited. And it took a long time, and I think everyone understood that it was going to be a big job. But the past 4 years, they've been 30th, 31st, 31st, and 31st. There's been literally zero signs of progress. Now, they've been picking high in the draft. They've been adding guys. Like I'm excited about Anton Frendel this year. There's certainly reasons to be like, all right, well, this team's going to be more fun to watch and better. But we just haven't really seen any progress yet, like not even incremental ones. And it's not necessarily imperative to do so. Like teams take jumps all the time. It wouldn't be crazy to see them finish 23rd or whatever, and that would be viewed as a positive. But I do think they kind of desperately need it, like especially with the swings they made this offseason, right? Like Kyle Davidson going out and trading fourth overall and then making Bowen Byram at least temporarily the highest paid defenseman in the league before Hughes and Makar's extensions kick in. Like they've kind of signaled that they are going to try to be better now finally. And I'm not sure they necessarily are going to be with the state of this team. And if that happens again and they're once again 30th in the league or whatever, like eventually there's going to need to be a reckoning here for them. And so that's why I kind of viewed it as pretty high stakes. Like they just need to show that they're going to be better, at least compared to what we've seen the past couple seasons.
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's a lot of pressure to make more noise and take steps in the right direction, but at the end of the day, the stakes aren't super high because they just need to be better than 30th or 31st or whatever it is to take a step in the right direction. And I think that there is pressure on Bedard and for the things to come into picture more clear around him in the next year or two, but also like they have so much money and they have so many young players that like should be getting better that like there is pressure and stakes in that with like those players to develop and take steps forward. But like they have the resources to really start pushing forward in the next year or two, regardless of how good the team is, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's all relative. I did a show, I guess the most recent show we did before we took that week off. We had Keith Kavanaugh from Puckpedia on, and we were looking at extension eligible players and kind of looking ahead in terms of guys who might get contracts this offseason or at the start of the season. And when we talked about the Blackhawks, we rattled through especially their young defensemen, right? And all these guys who came in with a lot of pedigree and excitement, but really struggled last year in a tough environment. Like the team wasn't good, and young defensemen go through those growing pains. But like a Levshinov, a Rinzel, like you go on down the line, I feel like we just need to see more from these guys in terms of development to feel confident that they're going to be the players who you actually extend long term and pay that money that you have available to you. And if it looks like it did for a lot of last year, then all of a sudden you get into some pretty uncomfortable conversations, I think, about this team and sort of where they're headed. And so I just think they need, like, from an individual level, certainly with these guys, we need to see something, but then it needs to actually coalesce to a team product as well. So you had the Blackhawks and the Leafs here. You didn't have any of the teams that I listed, hey? The Kings, the Bruins.
No, just because like I, I definitely I could agree with that based off of some of like the outlines that you've established with some of these teams and kind of the way that the perspective is. Like I can definitely see why those teams are there. I had the Bruins more like directly in the middle. And then the Kings I had just like slightly more or slightly it's confusing because I had them more towards like the pressure meter,
Right.
just slightly above the middle.
I'm not sure if you've seen this, and listen, there's a lot of time between now and the start of the season. The Bruins currently have the worst playoff odds of any team in the East,
That's pretty
which
stunning
I
to
found
me.
surprising, especially considering what I just said about the Red Wings. But it also speaks to, I think, like how generally like the West is much more top heavy because it's got the Canucks, the Flames, the Kraken at the bottom, but then it's got probably like four or five of the best six or seven teams in the league. So it's kind of more highs and lows, whereas the East is more condensed. And I think that's going to make sorting the playoff picture out that much more complicated. So it's not necessarily as crazy as it seems, but I did find that surprising because I mean, partly we saw what we saw from Marco Sturm last year. Like, I think he's going to be a floor raiser. And then specifically with Pasternak, but how well Swayman played last year, still like a competent veteran laden blue line. I like the JJ Paterka addition for them as well. Like, I in a tough division, I think they're going to be pretty good, but I'm not sure what it ultimately nets out to either, which is why I had them in this tier of teams that are kind of like retooling slash trying to figure out what the next 5 years are going to look like and still be pretty good right now, but not necessarily with as much upside as you'd hope for.
Yeah, I view like the odds of the playoffs thing to be more a reflection of their place in the division than their
Yeah.
place in the conference because I would be shocked if the Bruins were the worst team in the Eastern Conference. But I would also be really surprised if they ended up making the playoffs based off of where they stand and kind of the reset structure. I think that everybody can kind of acknowledge that last year they overachieved, but ultimately, like on paper, this team should be better than they were last year. Like I like the Paterka edition. You got a full year of Hagens. Hopefully that turns into something. Like I do like Will Borgen on the back end. Like another year, Fraser Minton with experience under his belt. Like I think that this is a fairly competent team without any real expectations. So that's why I put them in the middle.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of why I had them this low because I just don't really see the stakes that high. Like, I think we kind of have a pretty good feel for what they're going to be. I think with some room to grow, as you outlined, but not necessarily like much beyond that. I mean, you could say the same about the Kings, right? They get the new coach, and we've seen throughout various stops, like you probably will get a bump from Pierre Laviolette early on before things go off the rails. They certainly were better offensively after Artemi Panarin arrived, and that coincided with the Fiala injury at the Olympics, and he'll be back. So I think there is some offensive juice here, and maybe you could say the stakes are high just because you're kind of trying to like turn the leaf on the Kopitar era. First time he's not going to be there in 20 years. It's the last year Drew Doughty's under contract, so I think there's some figuring out or soul searching for them to do. But I also look at the age of the team, and it's like all their offseason moves were bringing in guys who are 35 years old or older and making the oldest team and slowest team in the league that much more so. And so I don't really view the stakes that high, but I guess the Pacific Division being what it is at least creates an opportunity for them to be the eighth seed again and probably get swept by the Avs. And so it's a bit of a repeat from last year in that perspective, maybe a bit more fun along the way, but I don't really view the stakes as that high for them because I don't really see what it's going to net out to.
Yeah, I hear that. For my fourth tier, I have the Islanders in there. Like, and the classification for this is like, don't need to be good, but need to be better. And like, I think the Islanders have rediscovered an exciting path and like just want to continue building on that. And then another team that I have in this grouping is the Blues because like I look at the Blues forward group and that's as excited as I've been about that group in some time. And I really like kind of the way that they've repositioned themselves. I still have massive, I wouldn't say massive. I still have some significant concerns about what they have on the back end, both on the blue line and in net. But I think that this is a really good example of a team kind of retooling, repositioning, whatever you want to call it, on the fly
Mm-hmm.
to give themselves a little bit more excitement. And I would like to see that pay off in year one to give them confidence moving forward.
So this is my tier five, but I'm on the same page with you. I had the Blues in this tier. I had the Islanders in this tier. I also had the Devils and the Senators. And I labeled this one as the let's have some fun tier. And
Okay.
for the Blues, I completely agree. They were really good in the final 25 games or so after Robert Thomas came back from his absence. And that line with him, Snuggerud, and Holloway was phenomenal. Joel Hofer was really good for them and is going to be the guy this year. So I think there's a lot of excitement there, and I think they're going to be fun. The Islanders, year two of Matthew Schaefer, I'm very curious to see what that looks like. Now, tempering my expectations just because of how inactive they were this offseason. Um, Matthew Darsh has been pretty much on vacation the entire time. He has not been following my script of working every week except for one because they bring in Matthias Michelli on July 1st, I believe, and that is quite literally the only NHL move they've made. I guess they brought in Vitek Vanacek as well to be a backup or a third goalie potentially, but um, it's been a very quiet offseason for them. They're going to kind of roll it over.
They
Yet
re-signed Tony DeAngelo.
yeah, I guess. Yeah. Okay. How could I forget that one? the reason why like I would normally put them even lower in terms of stakes, but Matthew Schaefer is so good and so exciting that I feel like that immediately just creates stakes for your organization because it's like this guy's so cheap right now. What we've seen from contracts for a defenseman, like 2 years from now, he could pretty much get a blank check and get whatever he wants, and that's going to make things more complicated for them. But while Horvat and Barzal are in their prime and he's playing this good, like I feel like there is some pressure for them to build on last year and not take a bit of a step back.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that's the last part is kind of what I was banking on there is like there's fear. There may not be like pressure or stakes in terms of winning, but like there's fear in getting worse and fear in taking a step back with Schaefer, especially if like say Schaefer isn't nearly as good as he was in his rookie year, which is unbelievable. Like, does that temper your expectations moving forward? So I think there's like a tiny bit of fear there, even if the expectations aren't massive.
So I said I had the Devils and Senators as well in this in terms of let's have some fun. I think that particularly applies to the Devils just because the last 3 years really have been so disappointing and such a slog. And they bring in a new GM. Jack Hughes will hopefully be healthy. Like they add some actual scoring juice lower in the lineup with, Manta and Evan Rodriguez and Jesper Boquist. And um, I'm curious to see what that looks like. I guess our stakes for them in terms of like, we'll see how this Quinn Hughes contract resolves itself and the viability of that in the future. But like, I do feel like turning the perception of what they've been the past couple of years into like once again being an ascending fun organization that's an actual landing spot if a player of that caliber becomes available is really important to them. And so I think there are stakes from that perspective. I think we've all come down from like our sky high expectations previously when, that first year they really kind of emerged in the scene, beat the Rangers in seven, lost to the Hurricanes. You're like, all right, man, this is going to be a perennial Stanley Cup contender. Like, I think there's a lot of work to be done before they get back to that level. But I do feel like from an entertainment perspective, there are some stakes in terms of like getting back on track to what they were previously and then sort of building on that years out.
Yeah, I had them a bit higher. I had them with like the third most stakes just because like I feel like we're on year what, 3 or 4 on and you say like we've kind of hit the reset button and tempered our expectations. Should we though? Like this is a team that's been expecting to be in the mix in the Eastern Conference for years at this point, and at some at some point they're gonna need to deliver something, or maybe questions start getting asked. Like we talk about the Quinn Hughes situation, and him finding potentially finding a way to New Jersey, which has everybody been talking about. I would consider the possibility of Jack being the one to move. Like if New Jersey just can't get out of whatever hole they're in, who's to say that he doesn't get fed up, follow the Larkin model, and be like, all right, I would like to get out of here and I want to win. I want to play with my brother. It's not going to happen here. Let's make it happen somewhere else. Like, I think there is pressure for them to start turning this thing around and putting the foot down on the gas and moving it forward. Do I expect them to be like a Stanley Cup contender? No, but I think you've seen enough of like a fatal flaw existing with this team every single year that they just need to escape the one, like having one thing that just completely derails their season, whether it's health, whether it's goaltending. Have a season in which most of the pieces are in place and you're competitive.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that's fair. Maybe I should bump them up even higher. Um, I did have the Senators here as well, just because I do think the past like whatever year or two, the whole Brady Kachuk situation and his future was hanging over the organization like a dark cloud, and sort of moving on from that and pivoting the way they did. And I think they did pretty well. Like I do think a guy like Paterka, as I talked to him in the past or whatever, like they could have gone even further, but sort of reallocating some of those resources, getting a bit younger and cheaper, adding William Eklund, like it's going to be a pretty good team again with a really high defensive baseline. And I just think it's a bit more free, I guess, now in terms of like not being so held captive by Brady Kachuk's whims and what that's going to look like and sort of this fear of how it's going to turn out. Like you've almost ripped the band-aid off in a way. And so the stakes aren't as high in terms of proving themselves necessarily as they were previously. But I think it's a good enough team where the stakes are there to like not take a big step back because they were rebuilding for so long and you want to consolidate off of getting back into the playoffs the past 2 years.
Yeah, I pretty much completely agree with that. Like it just feels like that the cloud and like the timeline that attached itself to Kachuk is removed, and like I fully expect the vibes to be different and better. And I think that the only way that stakes really present themselves this season is if they suck. Like if they suck, then you start asking questions like, okay, like what is this team without Brady Kachuk, and was his impact way higher than we all kind of viewed it as? And I think that's unlikely, but it's not. I have to acknowledge the possibility of that happening.
Yeah, it's not inconceivable, but I'm with you. I think it's such a good defensive team in particular that if they get just not league worst goaltending the way they did for much of last year, like I think they're going to be pretty good in a really tough division. We're into my tier four and like the top half of the league in terms of stakes. And this tier I had kind of like young teams that either need to level up or like show progress. Um, and that included I had the Blackhawks previously. I had the Sharks, the Blue Jackets, and the Ducks. Now, the Ducks stand out here as an aberration because they've actually made the playoffs and beat the Oilers last year. But because of their players getting more expensive now with what we saw from the Leo Carlson offer sheet, Cutter Gauthier's next contract, and the state of the blue line in general, I think it's fair to be like, all right, they're probably going to take a bit of a step back this season, but I still feel like those young players continue to develop. Like I do think there are stakes there. And then the ones for the Sharks and the Blue Jackets are a bit more obvious in terms of kind of proving themselves and going from being fun to all of a sudden actually being playoff teams that are having results to show for it.
Yeah, I have the Blue Jackets a little like significantly higher
I mean,
just
they honestly
because
might
of.
have the highest stakes in the league.
Yeah, that's what I have them in tier one.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I have them in tier one just based off of like if things don't go well and they are just continue to flounder, they seemingly have no organizational direction, and it's going to get worse because Zach Werenski's probably going to get louder and want to push his way out. So that's why I have them in one. It's kind of the same reason why I have Larkin and the Red Wings in the tier one. But to go back to like just above, like getting into more pressure young teams, I have the Sharks here as well.
Mhm.
And like I don't think they're a contender, and I think that they have a lot of runway to play with. They have a lot of freedom in what they are currently. They're a young, exciting team, but they're also a young, exciting team last year that was like absolutely horrendous defensively, and they've poured so much of their cup into just semi-competent defensemen who are on the back nine of their careers
Mhm.
that like if they don't get if those returns aren't there in year one when like they should be at their best right now, like those contracts are probably only going to get worse, or like those players are only going to get worse. They need to see the returns right now this year. And like based off of how last year went, them being a semi-competent defensive team potentially makes them a playoff team. So I think that those stakes are a little real. I have the Mammoth there because like they got in, but kind of found out pretty quickly that they were a bit overmatched and not fully ready for the playoffs. So that adds a little bit of pressure. This is where I have the Predators as well. And then I have the Capitals here. And maybe that's a bit too low in terms of like it's probably Ovechkin's last year. They maybe want to capitalize in this window, but I really like what they've done in terms of repositioning on like a bigger scale and bigger picture, that I don't necessarily view this as like, oh, they got to get it done in the Ovechkin window or you're screwed. It's more just like even before Ovechkin announced he was coming back, I was like, I kind of like this team. It's super random, but I kind of like what they've done.
Let's put a pin in the Capitals because I have them a bit higher and I've got a lot of thoughts on that. Same with the Mammoth, to no one's surprise. On the Sharks, real quick though, I do think there's something to be said for, when you go from being like this young, just expectation free team where you're just like having fun and to all of a sudden now, like I think everyone should reasonably expect that they're going to be 5 points better and make the playoffs. And it's the last year of Celebrini's ELC, all the stuff you mentioned about the defensemen they've invested in, even young guys like Ivar Stenberg. I want to see what that looks like. Michael Misa, building off of his rookie season, like I do think there are added stakes there, which is good. Like that's a natural progression, but there's questions to be answered. And yeah, the Blue Jackets, I've immediate regret as soon as I said it, and you push back on it because they probably should be the poster child for this exercise because this could go so bad. Last time you and I spoke, I think we spent 20, 30 minutes off the top talking about Marchenko at the time and then Werenski as well. And it was a pretty interesting conversation to look back at. Like, I feel like I was kind of proven right on the Werenski stuff because at the time it was, I forget the order of it, but it was like around when all was bubbling about him asking for a trade and the Stars making their offer. I feel like he might actually just want to stay there if the team can make the playoffs and show that there's a path ahead. But if that doesn't happen this year, then everything that's happened this offseason is just going to be dialed up so much more extremely. And so it's a massive season for them, I think. Where did you have the Ducks? Because I struggle with to do with them, but I felt like they kind of fit here thematically, but I wasn't really sure because they are a bit different than some of these other young teams.
Yeah, I had the Ducks six, which would be your third.
Yeah.
And like I established that as real pressure. And I do think the Ducks are under real pressure based off of how this offseason has gone. Just kind of I would call it the mismanagement of this team and its assets. And they took a big step forward last year, established themselves as a fun, exciting team on the right track. And to immediately be pulled off that track would be really, really discouraging, especially given how preventable it was from a managerial perspective. I think that that's where the organizational pressure is established. Like, I still think that this is a really good team, but if they take a step back and their blue line's kind of a disaster at this point in time,
Hmm.
like when I say this is a really good team, this is the team that has really good bones, but their blue line really worries me. And I just feel like they've been completely mismanaged, and it puts them in a position where you think that this was all avoidable and you start considering changes based off of where you are year to year.
Um, I had the Mammoth and the Capitals, which you mentioned earlier, in tier two, all the way up, um, with the Canadians and the Sabres, and we can talk more about them in a second. But the reason why I had those two specifically, because you had them a bit earlier, the Mammoth, I do think have quite high stakes. Andre Tourigny is the fourth longest tenured coach in the league. The only guys who have been with their teams longer are John Cooper, Jerry Bednar, and Rod Brindamore, and all three of those have now won Stanley Cups with their current teams. And I think everyone just like whenever you see one of these coaches lists, like just because he's been there for so long, and I think people think pretty highly of him, everyone's like, yeah, he's like a top 10 coach, but we haven't actually really seen reason to believe that's the case. And I think the expectations are much higher now after they finally get back in the playoffs. They legitimately test the Golden Knights. That was a very competitive series. It could have gone either way. And then they go out and they add Vinny Trocheck, Anders Lee, two guys in their mid 30s, bring in Sebastian Cossa as the backup goalie. Like, I think there's a reasonable expectation that they're going to join this Central Division elite with the Avs, Stars, and Wild. And it might not necessarily happen this year, but I think it's fair to be like, all right, they should be a lot better. And now we should expect them to actually keep winning as opposed to being a fun upstart organization. And so I think the Mammoth have pretty sneaky high stakes this year in terms of like building on last year and sort of showing that they're ready to level up.
Yeah, I think that like their core still has a good amount of runway, and like
Yep.
they're still considered a young team. But you look at the additions that they made this offseason, and it kind of provides an indication of where they think they're at and where they want to be, which is like I specifically like Vinny Trocheck and Anders Lee. Like you get two guys who are on the older side who have established presence and locker room presence, and like this is a team that not only wants to be a playoff team but wants to push it forward in the playoffs. So yeah, like I definitely think that if that's your goal and that's your outlook on your team, there are stakes for sure.
The Capitals similarly have a lot of stakes, in my opinion, because I mean they get older this offseason, right? They go out, they add Alex Tuck, they bring in Boone Jenner, they add Jordan Kyrou as well, who's a bit younger, but still kind of getting into a spot where they have a lot invested in this team. Now they're trying to manage these two timelines, which is also a very unconventional team build, and so I think there's pressure to like show that it's a viable um, blueprint, I guess, for an organization to follow because teams don't typically do this. I'm pretty intrigued by them and I'm excited to watch it play out. But there's a lot of moving parts here for Spencer Carberry to juggle. It's Alex Ovechkin's last year, as you mentioned, and just how much they poured into this team. I was looking on Puckpedia. I think they have like 112 million in actual salary they're paying this year. So like they're all in with this group in terms of like viewing themselves as a top team and they're paying accordingly and they need to prove it now and kind of show that the pieces fit and the young guys like Leonard and Protas and sort of like keep getting better while these guys are still in their prime. So I think they're in a really interesting spot. The other teams in that tier, the Habs and the Sabres, I'm curious where you had them because obviously both are coming off of very successful and productive seasons, played a heck of a series against each other in round two in the East. Both, I don't want to say they took steps back this summer. I think the Sabres kind of did, at least in the short term,
Yeah.
because you lose Tuck and Byram. But I think it was clearly the right business decision on both sides. And I do think there's kind of like underappreciated room for growth here as well, right? Because while these guys are already really good, like I think Benston and Doan in particular have a lot of room for improvement. Yuri Kulik being healthy, Noah Osland being healthy, a
Oh,
full
nice.
season of Consta Helenus, like I think these guys kind of covering for a lot of that and leveling up even further is in play. And the reason why I had stakes for them is you finally come out of the rebuild, you end the playoff drought. Everyone was so Sabres pilled last year. Both of our shows certainly were in pushing that agenda, and it was such a fun story. And they did a lot of work in rehabilitating their image as well, right? As an organization, as a destination, to the point where a Connor Hellebuck seemed willing to accept a trade there, which I think would have been completely far fetched a couple of years ago. And so, kind of building on that momentum and making sure you don't take a step back, even if it's just for one season, I do think is pretty important. Even if they don't get better this year, I think once again, kind of being a fun playoff team is pretty important for their sort of long term health as an organization.
Yeah, that's exactly why I had them in the third tier here. And it's not the first time that they've entered a season with pressure because it's just been a different kind of pressure where it's like, okay, there's been this cloud hanging over you. How do you get out of it? Like we saw early on in this past season, like questions being asked about the state of that team early on in a season really wears on guys like Tage Thompson and Darlene. It's just like there's so much frustration that was baked into that pressure. Some of that's been lifted and it's been changed, but we don't know how that like manifests itself with this current group. It's just a completely different brand of pressure, but I do think that that pressure is absolutely there. You do not want to take a step back, and there's pressure on some of these younger guys to fill the gaps in what you lost in the offseason. And I do agree with you. It's a weird place to be in where you recognize this team as being like significantly worse on paper, but not holding it against them based off of what they lost and like what the cost of keeping those guys would
Hmm.
have been. And so it's a weird spot, but I do think there's real pressure for the Canadians. I had them more in the middle because I just feel like they're still on a very flexible timeline. And realistically, I feel like we can and like should acknowledge that an Eastern Conference final run for that team last year was like way above their pay grade, and they rode an awesome wave to that spot, and it just like is so fun, but so unexpected.
Well, they've also kept their powder dry this summer, right? Like I know there's been a lot of rumors around Marchenko, but they still haven't made that move yet. Like they
Right.
have a bunch of cap space. They haven't traded any of their futures or prospects. Like there's room for them to get better, and it seems like they're going to approach that. But it's kind of a TBD until they do so. The reason why I had them this high, though, beyond the natural fit between them and the Sabres as rivals, was just when you make the Eastern Conference final the way they did. Like I think there's a natural expectation to not necessarily get better on that, but like not take a big step back either, right? Just to kind of show the young players are moving in the right direction and you're building as an organization. So I think that speeds up the timeline a little bit, if anything. We're into my final tier, and I got to admit, I took a pretty lazy approach with this one because I just listed all the top teams, generally the older ones who are firmly in their Stanley Cup window and are true contenders and have the best odds for it. And that was the Stars, the Wild, the Golden Knights, the Hurricanes, the Lightning, the Panthers, the Avs, and the Oilers. Do you have any disagreement there? I think there's a scale there in terms of some
Can you
teams
list
probably.
those again for me?
It was the Stars and Wild.
Hmm.
Um, I had the Stars at the bottom of this list in terms of the least stakes, just because the Robertson situation has been so bizarre. Maybe you could argue that that increases the stakes because you might lose them, or you kind of need to prove that it's going to be a fit between the two this season. The Wild, certainly Wild, this Quinn Hughes thing is kind of hanging over them until they sort that out and at least get more buffer with him. And then the Golden Knights, because they're always in this tier, because they're always in their Stanley Cup window and their players are pretty old. The Hurricanes, just trying to repeat as Stanley Cup champions. I think they have a long runway and so much flexibility, but it's always a cool storyline. And then the Lightning and the Panthers and the Avs and the Oilers. Those are like that's my Stanley Cup tier.
Yeah, so I have basically all of those teams in my second and third tiers.
Okay.
Um, with one exception. I'll get to that in a little bit, but I have
But don't you think
uh
for all those teams, like the reason why I think the stakes are high is because every year you don't win the Stanley Cup if you're one of those teams is a disappointment, regardless of how it shakes out. Like even if you make the conference final or whatever and lose to a slightly better team or banged up or whatever, it's viewed as like that was a missed opportunity, and I don't know how many more of those I'm gonna get.
Yeah, so like I initially had the Hurricanes like right in the middle because I was like they won the Stanley Cup, they got over the hump, they answered a lot of the questions, and like you also you play a ton of hockey, and there's if you don't win the Stanley Cup the following year, like it's gonna be fine. Like their long-term outlook is still awesome,
Yep.
and like their salary structure is awesome, but I bumped them up just because like you don't want to take steps backwards, and like they are positioned to do it again. Like they're basically returning the same team. So I bumped them up a little bit in terms of their pressure.
Well,
Though
and you got to defend your crown.
correct, yeah. And the difference that I have here, I would say is I have the Penguins in this second most pressure tier because of the Crosby factor and just based off of like what things could look like at the midway point based off of yeah, last year was nice. Like it really quieted some of that discussion for a year, but like we hit the reset button. The Eastern Conference is going to look different than it did last year. Does the Penguins outlook look different? And like what is the grand scope of that? And I think that there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stakes based on the consequences of what could happen in the front end of the year. Malkin's on a 1 year deal. Like this is just a weird spot for the Penguins. So there's a lot of pressure. I have all of those teams, like I said, in the second and third tiers. I put the Oilers at like code red,
Yeah.
most pressure. It just seems like there is no team facing more pressure than the Edmonton Oilers this year, based off of the McDavid factor, based off of just sort of the lack of satisfaction within that locker room, based off of they were so desperate that they went out and hired Mike Babcock.
Yeah.
Like there's just so many signs pointing to this has to have immediate and really strong returns in year one of whatever fucking button that they pushed this offseason. So they absolutely have the most pressure to me. And then under them, I have the Blue Jackets and Red Wings just because of the turmoil within those organizations.
The big three. Um, yeah, I think that's fair. I think the Oilers do have the highest stakes. For all the reasons you mentioned. I think specifically McDavid, right? Like he's turning 30 this season. He's got 2 years left at this ridiculous contract now. I mean, it was crazy at the time he signed, like in terms of how little he took. But now with some of the deals you're seeing, like they need to maximize that over these next 2 years. And so every year you have him and Draisaitl. It's going to be sky high leverage.
People
I
keep
think
talking about it as a 2 year window for the Oilers, like 2 year McDavid window. It more feels like a 1 year window to me because like you've got this 1 year window before questions really start getting asked as to do you risk playing it out in that final year, assuming that there's nothing that happens in terms of that contract, or do you consider cashing in on that final year, getting something back and repositioning yourself? So like it does feel like where the pressure is in this 1 year window.
Um, I think the Avs should be up there as well. Like based on how good they were last year, how they exited the playoffs, getting swept by the Golden Knights, how old a lot of their players are, particularly the forwards they've invested in. It's the final year. Cale Makar is making 9 million, and that's next deal is going to double that realistically. And so then all of a sudden, even with the cap going up between him, Natchez, and McKinnon, that is going to make it pretty difficult to fill out the rest of your team and be as deep as they were last season. And I feel like, getting back to the mountaintop, which they've failed to do so ever since they won the cup, is making the expectations pretty high. And then the Panthers, I think, similarly, like it's tough to gauge because they were such a shell of a team last year, but then they go out and they make the Brady Kachuk trade. Um, they're viewed as the Stanley Cup favorites on the betting market. And I think understandably, like at full health, until we see someone beat them, I think it's fair to wonder whether that's possible. But I guess for me, like they need to sort of show that last year was just a one off where everything went wrong from a health perspective and they are going to be healthy. And I don't think that's necessarily as much of a given as it seems because a lot of these guys are older and have played a lot of hockey. And those types of players typically get hurt. And so they kind of need to prove it. And I could very easily see a scenario where they do so and they're once again the Stanley Cup champions. But I feel like if things start off with another kind of run of injuries, then I do think it's going to be fair to wonder like whether that window closed and whether that's just the new future for them. So I don't know. Like there's no stakes in terms of like they've already won the cup twice. So like regardless of what happens, this is going to be a complete success for this organization. But in terms of extending the window and proving last year was a one-off, like it's a pretty important season.
Yeah, I struggled with where to put the Panthers just based off of like this is just like a continuation of an already successful window. Like you've got Brady Kachuk there now. Like yeah, there are expectations, but not really too many consequences. I feel like this team has made its bed and is going to sleep in it one way or another, whether it's good sleep, whether it's bad sleep. But yeah, I just think that like because they are considered one of the best teams and also have a major question mark in net without Bobrovsky, like your goaltending tandem is Jacob Markstrom and Akira Schmid. Like, what could that look like? There is stakes there. So I put them relatively high. And then on the first part, it's interesting that you have that because like I initially had the Avalanche at number one, and then I looked at it and I was just like, they're not in the same position as these three other teams. It felt very reactionary to me, but I do think they're on the higher end of the second tier because of like the Makar factor, because of the way that they ended out. Like people are asking fraud questions about them now. Jared Bednar should absolutely be on the hot seat. Like this is just a team that I think that you look at now, and they went from being the class of the NHL to again like being called fraudsters, being considered disappointments, and you look at the grand scope of their window and say they've only won one cup and haven't really made a ton of noise outside of that. How does that make you feel about what they've accomplished on the whole? And it's not amazing. I feel like you got to do more when you have two generational pillars on your forward group and then on your defensive group. And on top of that, like I think they've gotten worse this offseason.
Yeah, no, they undoubtedly have. I had the Penguins lower, acknowledging that there's stakes when you have 1 year left of Crosby, Carlson, and Malkin under contract. Um, at the same time, last year was such found money for them. If you think about how we thought about them as a group last year, this time, that like, regardless of what happens this year, I just think that was like such a fun story. And even if it goes south, I don't think it's the end of the world, although it will be bittersweet. I feel like you haven't mentioned the
I would
Flyers.
I would call it a found coupon rather than found money because I do feel like that money is it expires. Like it was a fun year, but that coupon will expire.
Yeah.
The Flyers I put directly in the middle because they're kind of the case of the Bruins where They were much better than we expected. They were much more fun than we expected. There should be a competitive team, but I don't know if there should be real expectations.
Yeah, I felt the same way. I mean, if they had gotten Leo Carlson and the Ducks didn't match that offer sheet, they'd be much higher on the list. But they kind of took their swings, right? They almost got him and Drew on that one day. And I think people were like, all right, well, it's fun to see them kind of back in the mix there. They're obviously coming off a successful year last year. And so I feel like almost like the offseason is moving forward for them in terms of finding that number one center and what that's going to look like. Um, After failing to do so here is probably going to be higher stakes than actually the start of this season when the games start. All right, buddy. Well, that was a lot of fun. We rattled through our stakes tiers, had some nice disagreement as well, which is great. I'm glad we didn't just have the carbon copies of the lists, and that kind of shows that it's very subjective, but also we approach it differently. So that was a lot of fun. I'll let you promote some stuff here on the way out. What are you up to these days? What's going on with What Chaos?
What chaos? We're kind of shifting gears a little bit, pushing towards the start of the season. We're still once a week right now, on YouTube, and then once a week on Patreon. What chaos dot or patreon.com/what chaos, and then YouTube. You just find us at What Chaos Show, and we're having fun. We're doing player interviews. We had Jamie Drysdale a week or two ago, and that was a
Mhm.
ton of fun. Yeah, it's just that's the grind. It continues, doesn't stop, continues to pick up momentum as we get closer to the season, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
All right, buddy. Well, looking forward to that. My plugs, give us 5-star review wherever you listen. Similarly, we're starting to post shows on YouTube. So if you want to watch along with us, including this conversation with Pete today, you could do so. My other plug is as I said on the last show, we got some merch going as well. So I'm showing you here on video. We got the hat, we got the t-shirts. So you could find that. I posted about it in the Discord, but also on the Patreon, and we got some discounts for existing subscribers. So another perk if you haven't subbed to us yet to join us and rock some PDO cast merch. It's not quite as nice as some of those pink What Chaos hats that I've seen, but we're trying our best and we're going to expand the catalog as we go along. That is all for today. We'll be back here tomorrow. I think we got a couple more shows planned this week now that we're back from our brief vacations. So join us for that. In the meantime, thank you for subscribing and for listening to the Hockey PDO cast.